Welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van de Nederlandse Kubernetes podcast. De podcast over Kubernetes voor iedereen. Ik ben uw gastheer Ronald Kers en ik zit zoals altijd met de enige echte...
Hallo Ronald.
Jan Stomphorst.
Ja, het is wel heel leuk. We zitten met heel veel mensen in deze ruimte opeens.
Ja, dat is nieuw voor ons.
Ja,
en we zijn zelfs video aan het opnemen.
Zo, ik ben benieuwd wat ze ervan gaan zien en wat wij ervan vinden.
Hoe wij er op camera uitzien. Ja, dat is natuurlijk net zoals een radiohost. We doen niks voor niks, een podcast en geen video.
Vast niet knap. Maar we volgens mij hebben een hele leuke gast.
Ja, we hebben zeker een leuke gast. Dat is Malcolm Matalka, if I pronounce it correctly.
Yep, that's correct.
Ah, great. From Terrateam.
Yep.
Nice.
Ja,
two out of two.
two out of two.
Malcolm, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, nice to have you. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yep, so my name is Malcolm. I am a co-founder of a product called Terrateam, which focuses on collaboration for Terraform and OpenTofu. So if you have a small but growing team, we're probably a good solution there. Specifically, if you're using GitHub as well, we have that niche.
Okay. And how did you get started in the IT? What's your background?
I have been a software engineer from very young. So I was very lucky in that my parents had access to computers when I was probably starting 8, 9, 10. I got to build a computer when I was very young. I was always taking things apart as well. So that was a lot of fun. And eventually...
Computers or everything?
Oh, everything, but computers as well. For good and bad. And eventually I sort of wondered, how do you get the computer to do the thing? Mm-hmm. And that led me to software. And I remember there was a game way back in the day on MS-DOS called Nibbles. And it was a text-based game. It was the snake game where you eat a number and you get longer and you have to make sure you don't hit yourself. And it was written in QBasic or some form of BASIC. And I remember reading it and being like, I have no idea what's going on here, but it seems pretty cool. And then my parents signed me up for a C++ class, which I was way too young to understand. So I sort of stumbled through that, didn't do very good. But, everything sort of builds and builds and builds.
It's a great foundation.
Yeah, then slowly sort of getting stuff. So there's a lot of failures along the way that led to just really appreciating software. And then by the time I was 18 or something like that, I quit my job at a supermarket and... was given a really actually kind of unique opportunity by a guy that wanted to expand his very small company. And he was like, well, I don't know the software stuff very well, so have fun. So 18, building, it was a small company, but still building out all the infrastructure for that and the main software. And that was an opportunity a lot of people don't get, especially now, because software is much more established. But back then, sort of like, well, we don't really know what we're doing, so just... hopefully it works.
You started with Windows NT or?
Oh, when for development. So I've been mostly a Unix, Linux person since very young. I started on DOS way back in the day, and then Windows 3.11, and then Windows 95, and then Windows NT. But once I had my own computer and was just able to do whatever I wanted on it, I switched over to Linux.
Which distro?
I started on Red Hat. And then went to Slackware, and went to Gentoo. And I think, so I'm thinking back, like, in those days, you would, at least for me, like, every week, you were sort of wiping your computer and installing a new distro. Be like, oh, how's this one? What's different about this one? And I'm trying to think, like, what did I do? Like, dot files management is a big thing now. If you're like, when you switch a computer, you want to bring all your configuration with you. And I guess I just started from scratch every single week. Like there's no concept of backups back then. There was no, you were barely on the internet. You had a modem that you did with a 14.4 baud on there.
Compiling your kernel.
Yeah, exactly. Make Mr. Proper. I remember that one.
Yeah. I bought the first CDs of Slackware.
Oh, wow.
And I started with Slackware.
Must be like 93 or something like that, right?
It's before everything.
Yeah.
So, that's awesome. Awesome. And how did you get to Terrateam then? How did you get...
The journey there?
Yeah.
So I did, like I said, I did software development for a long time. I really started professionally when I was 18. And because I had so much influence at that company, that was a good learning opportunity. And then I switched to going to larger companies. I worked at an investment bank for a while as a software person, and then switched over to working at some unicorns here in Europe. And just growing the skill set there, working on teams of different sizes was really helpful. And along that way, so larger companies have a lot of infrastructure problems, but so do smaller companies.
Yeah.
And they're kind of different problems at the same time, right? Like you have a company with, let's say, no dedicated infra person, and the team's growing, and they have to do 20 things, but they also have to make sure they make their EC2 instance and all that. And then you have companies with infra groups larger than the smaller company has total employees. So I think my friend and I, my co-founder Josh, we were looking at this and we sort of thought, well, like, there's not a lot of people just focusing on the smaller organizations that say, you show up on the first day and we'll get you going in that first day. And also, we're not going to try to do stuff to keep you in the product. If you don't like it, then go find what works for you. Like that's what we want. We want to make a product that people that enjoy using. And we didn't see that there as a niche. That's something people were doing already. So we thought we could do it. We started with a product called Atlantis, which is an open source tool for running plans and applies on your Terraform, and didn't think it really fit what we needed to do. So we went back to the drawing board and built the product from what we wanted, and then luckily other people seemed like they liked it as well.
You're working on two products now, the Terrateam part and the OpenTofu part.
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit of what the difference are, or what are the Terrateam and OpenTofu?
Yep. So August 10th last year, HashiCorp came out and they changed the license of many of their products. So the core of their product line, Terraform, Vault, Nomad, etc., was
a black day in the history.
Yeah, exactly. All that was completely open source and real open source too. You could take that, do whatever you want with it, and the spirit of open source build on this foundation. And for various reasons, they decided to change that to what's called a BUSA license, which is source available, but it is highly restricted on what you can do with it. And on top of that, the restrictions they placed on it were very vague and unclear. Like you're not allowed to host it or embed it. What does that mean? Nobody knows. They have an FAQ that doesn't clarify it even more, so it's even less clear.
So for hosting companies, that's issue.
Yes, it is. And so our product, and there's a lot of products like ours we all have our different niche, different type of user we're trying to make their lives better. We run Terraform for those customers. And this was a problem because now going forward, we couldn't do that. So a bunch of us got together, all of us competitors, by the way, but we all sort of saw the same thing. And we decided that the right thing to do was to fork Terraform into what's now called OpenTofu, and then give it a true open source life. So that includes it's in Linux Foundation. And one of the requirements from the Linux Foundation is you can never close source it or change that license. Today, I believe the application to get into CNCF was officially opened. So it's going to go there. That's the next stop for it. And since August, we've all been working together to make that a reality, make OpenTofu a viable and solid competitor to the now source available Terraform. And I think, so if you read the internet around this time, there's a lot of differing opinions about whether this was the right move or not for HashiCorp. Now, for me personally, I can understand Vault and Nomad and those ones a little bit more because those are really, it's a software package that HashiCorp wrote and they hand it to you, and the value is there. It's that software package. Now, Terraform, I believe, is very different, and that the value of Terraform is not really in a software package. It's all the things the community has done, all the providers,
all the plugins,
all that. The actual core of what Terraform does is actually kind of not interesting. It just sort of runs these plugins. I'm not saying it's easy or anything like that, but if you just gave someone the Terraform CLI, they're like, okay, I can't do anything with it. It's not valuable to me. And so it's much more of a community project, and I think it was the wrong decision to include that in the change of license. And I think we're also seeing that with OpenTofu. It's getting, so infra projects don't get adopted very quickly because it involves changing your infrastructure to suit it. But OpenTofu, one of the values there is it's meant to be backwards compatible with Terraform. And we are seeing people already switching to it and start using it, even though it went into general availability around last week.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's awesome news that you're forking a project and it's getting there by the community.
So
Yeah.
for the people that don't know the term Terraform or infrastructure as a code, or they are unknown or unfamiliar with those terms, give a little of an explanation what the technologies can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll make sense if you go back a little bit to how things were prior to Terraform and infrastructure as code as an idea in general. So before cloud, if you had infrastructure as a company, you went to a data center and people physically installed machines, and then your system administrator went in there and set it up. Probably not in a very reproducible way. They probably went in and manually modified things.
Yeah, I did that too.
And then the cloud comes along, and now you have APIs where you can bring machines up. And now it's more than just machines, right? You have where before you would run a database on a machine you managed. Now you can just bring the database up.
Mm-hmm.
There's no machine you're really interacting with there. Or maybe you want to do some load balancing. So now rather than start a load balancing machine, you just start a load balancer. So you have a lot of this new complexity, and everything's API driven. So you want a way to run that API, not by clicking around someplace, but by treating it as actual code. That way you can get all the benefits that we get from code, particularly in terms of pull requests. You can see what's going to happen before you do it. People can sign off on it. You get more people involved, where before one person would click around and hopefully they told people what was going to happen. Maybe, maybe not. And so infrastructure as code is really turning your infrastructure management into development with the same life cycle as your software has.
Okay.
Yeah, so really reproducible also.
Exactly. And you can also, a feature that all of us in this space have is something called drift detection. So let's say somebody, you've created your load balancer with Terraform or OpenTofu, and someone goes in and modifies the setting. You can run periodically, you can check to be like, hey, does what the load balancer look like actually match what my code says? And if it doesn't match, that's called drift. And then you either know you have to import that change into your code, or maybe that change is wrong and you want to rerun the code to undo it.
Yeah, it just gives a lot of flexibility.
Also,
Yes.
if for some reason a hacker goes in your infrastructure and changes everything, you can detect and repair.
Yep. Additionally, so now that everything...
Or a colleague, stupid colleague.
So an initial benefit there too is now that things are in code, you can run other tools on it to make sure they're following the best practices. Maybe that they're not referencing software packages that they shouldn't. Whereas before, if it was just someone clicking around, you don't know what practices they're following. You can't enforce that. So you start with infrastructure as code, and then you get to add all these other things that as software developers you've had for decades, but now it applies to your infrastructure. And that's a big change. And it doesn't sound big when you say it, but if you've ever done infrastructure before that, you're like, wow, all right, this actually makes things a lot different.
But is that also the thing you just said? We're focusing on small business for small companies. So in my experience, if you have a small company and you roll out once in 2 years your cluster, why do I have to put that in like a Terraform or OpenTofu?
For the customers that we focus on, they're small and growing, and it's not necessarily that you've created a cluster, you just let it sit there for a while, and you're not necessarily doing code releases through Terraform, but even a smaller company, because the cloud is so, you're not just making machines and putting software on it, you're making load balancers as concrete things, you're making databases as concrete things. There's actually, even a small organization actually has a lot more dynamicism in it than it maybe was back in the day. So even a smaller organizations that we see, which maybe they have 2 or 3 people actually doing Terraform changes, they're still doing them once, twice a week.
Okay.
For even a small organization, just because they have, maybe they're making S3 buckets. You got a new feature coming out, you want your S3 bucket, maybe you need some new load balancer rules, all that.
What's your definition of small companies?
20 to 100.
20 to 100. Okay.
Total employees.
Yeah, that's just to keep that in the same page perspective. Hey, and I learned Terraform a really long time ago, and the initial idea of Terraform was create, destroy, create.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still the thing? Because let me elaborate. The first Kubernetes I deployed with Terraform, and we had HashiCorp also in the podcast. I wanted to upgrade my Kubernetes cluster. It destroyed my Kubernetes cluster, and it created Kubernetes cluster again. And that was production, and so that was not good.
That's not good.
So is that still a thing, or is that?
No, well, it depends. So like I said before, Terraform, the value of it is really in these community-provided providers, and they vary in range and quality. Most of them are going to be able to say, oh, I know this. We call that a resource, like a machine is a resource, load balancer is a resource. It'll say, we know this exists, and we know how to diff its configuration with what you've specified. We know how to update that.
Yeah.
Other providers aren't so smart. Maybe they just don't know how to make that change, and they delete it and make a new one, or destroy it and make a new one. Most providers at this point, especially so something like AWS, used like pretty much universally, of course, we're using Terraform, and GCP as well. Those ones for pretty much anything are going to be smart enough to know I know how to do the diff here.
Okay, yeah, that's awesome.
But if you're changing like the AMI that machine uses, like you have to destroy it and make it again.
Well,
just to clarify, what is the AMI?
The AMI, that is the ID of effectively the virtual machine image that virtual machine will run.
Yeah, just.
So if you're changing the image ID, you probably have to destroy it.
Probably, yeah. Just a question that also popped up is when a company is already using Terraform and they want to switch to OpenTofu, is that easy, or what do they have to take in account to make the switch?
One of the guarantees with OpenTofu is that it's compatible with the same version release number as Terraform. So right now you can just install Tofu and switch your command to Tofu. Mm-hmm. You could even symlink or alias Terraform to Tofu, and it'll just work.
Oh. Okay. And is that going to be in the future also?
That's the plan. There is a pretty strong commitment. At the same time, though, OpenTofu, part of the reason for its creation was this sense of frustration from the Terraform maintainers that they weren't taking enough community feedback and pull requests and input from the community in. And in that sense, if the community starts saying, well, at this point, we're okay being a new thing because we value these features that would make backwards compatibility either very hard or impossible, then it might go in that direction. Currently, that's not the plan, but again, it's a community-driven project. It's that's part of the idea. There are features coming in that will make it so going Terraform to OpenTofu is possible, but it might be harder to go Tofu to Terraform. Big one that I'm personally excited about is what's called encrypted state. So the way that OpenTofu and Terraform know to do a diff versus a destroy and create is they have to keep a state file around somewhere. So it knows I created this machine, it's managed by me, etc. And that state file has to be stored someplace. So most companies like ourselves have state storage. We'll just store it for you. It's a small JSON blob. It's not a big deal. A lot of people use, for example, S3 or the Google Cloud Storage. And there's backends that say, just store it here, give me the credentials, etc. Some people have requirements or desires that is actually encrypted. So if anyone finds a way to get to it, it's useless to them. And that has been a pull request that's been sitting in Terraform repository for quite a while. Yeah. And it's being worked on now. And I believe it's slated for 1.7, but it's kind of a big feature, so it might come out a little bit later. But that's being developed into OpenTofu, and people are pretty excited about it. And that would be, once it's encrypted, you'll have to figure out a way to decrypt it to get it back into Terraform if you want.
Yeah, of course. Sure. But that's an awesome feature.
Yeah, it's really great. There's a lot of clever stuff going on there too. For example, a lot of state storage backends, they know that it's JSON, so they check it for some things, or some might want to visualize it, etc. And you don't want those backends to just fail. So even if visualizing it wouldn't make sense, you still want them to be able to store it. So they're doing work around the keys and the values would become encrypted, but the structure is still the same. Yeah. Okay. And then I think you can do really cool things in the future. Like maybe you have a big state file with that contains your infrastructure and your infrastructure, and you want to store those sub keys as different keys. So only you can access yours and you're yours. And so there's a lot of stuff you can do. It's a very, the implementation is both simple but flexible in what you'll be able to accomplish with it.
Okay. That's a contradiction. Simple, flexible.
Bij IaC-ICT staat alles in het teken van continuïteit waarborgen voor bedrijfskritische applicaties. Of het nu gaat over Managed OTAP, Cloud en Kubernetes, ze geven hier invulling aan om door samen met hun klanten een toekomstbestendige strategie uit te stippelen voor het gehele proces van ontwikkelen tot en met productie.
But you also are working on a newer feature, the test feature.
Yep, that actually rolled out in 1.6, which is part of general availability. And just to be clear, there's a team of very talented people working on OpenTofu. So I don't want to take credit for what all these other people have done. There's a lot of, it's actually pretty incredible the amount of developer power that's been thrown at OpenTofu. Mm-hmm. But so the test feature is actually it's really interesting, I think, because it was partially in Terraform before the license change, but in an incomplete state. And then the license change happened. And part of what happened with the license change is that those who are going to work on OpenTofu can't look at Terraform code ever again. It's not allowed because there's legal concerns there.
Yeah, of course.
So at the point when OpenTofu was forked from Terraform, that's all anyone had. And so there's this partial feature in there which mostly works, but it has some bugs. And I think it was almost lucky that it was like this, because you knew what test was supposed to do, and you knew there were some test cases there as well. So you knew where to go with it, but it was also not being done meant you had to learn the source code quite a bit to actually complete it, but it was very narrow in scope. So you just need this test functionality to work. And I think that's really it's a great way for the team to sort of cut their teeth on a new code base and a new feature without this daunting task of trying to take the whole thing on. Imagine if test wasn't there at all, and you're really trying to figure out, how does this work at all, and how should we go about it? Yeah.
Where to start?
So really good confidence builder in that we can do this, and now we understand the code base a lot better.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, we're talking about Terraform, but we've got Puppet, we've got Salt, we've got Ansible. We're talking about OpenTofu. That's better. What is the case that I'm using OpenTofu instead of an Ansible or Salt or Puppet or Chef? Why do you have to use OpenTofu?
To preface that, with a lot of these tools, you can squint hard enough to sort of get them to use all these use cases. Mm-hmm. However, the way I look at it is Terraform, OpenTofu, is really good when you're creating your infrastructure. So you're sort of coming from the outside. I need to make these things. And things like Chef and Ansible are, once it's there, I want to go and configure the pieces inside of it. In particular, things that don't have API endpoints. So a common example might be you bring up a machine and you want to make sure certain packages are on it.
Yeah.
That would be a great use case for Ansible, Puppet, Chef. Also, let's say you want to do some database management where the database is there already because you've created it with Terraform, but you need to do some work to go in and run it inside of there. So Terraform and a lot of IaC-tools are what's called declarative, where you say, I declare these things should exist, and then once I've done that, I'm done. And things like Ansible are more imperative, where it's, I want to run this task on here. And part of that includes there being declarative in the sense, I want these packages installed, and it'll install the packages that aren't there. But a lot of it too is I want to do these things across my fleet and not, and if I rerun it, I want to redo those things, not I've done it once and then that means it's done.
So in a greenfield situation, I want to use OpenTofu for deploying all the machines and use Ansible for configuring my applications.
Yep. That is something you can definitely do. A lot of, at least our customers, I think if you're an enterprise, you might have larger fleets where regenerating everything might not be viable. But for a lot of the smaller groups, they will just deploy a container image, and that has all the packages and everything installed on there.
Yeah, of course.
And so they don't really have to worry, but once it's up, it just starts running and you go. So at least for the people we work with, we see them less using something like Ansible or Chef, but we definitely see larger people that have more of this stratified solution of, I have my infrastructure that's really long lived, and then I just have things I need to do on top. A good example, especially for large organizations, is patching security holes. You might not be able to rebuild your entire company from scratch when that happens. If you're large, you just want to go in and say, like, update this package.
Yeah. Can you do the things that Ansible does also with OpenTofu? So can I change my applications or run those tasks also with OpenTofu?
You can. It's kind of frowned upon given the model of how it works. So there is something called, you can run any command you want inside of OpenTofu.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is it sort of breaks this model of, in OpenTofu, you plan your change and then people go and review it and say, okay, and you apply your change.
Yeah.
And you really want the plan to be the things you're going to do. And running commands, there's not a clear mechanism within OpenTofu to say, here's the things I'm going to do once that command runs. It's really about the...
Yeah, but that's the biggest difference. And that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome that you have a plan and then run. And that's really a good use case. It differs from Ansible.
Yeah. I know Ansible has this ability to... They have like a check feature where you can sort of do almost a dry run, but not everything in Ansible really supports it well. And some things in Ansible inherently don't support it. And something like OpenTofu is really trying to be everything you should be able to say what I want to do so people can say, yes, do it.
And what are the limits of OpenTofu, or what are the challenges?
Limits? To interpret your question another way, what's the scope of OpenTofu?
That is better. Better formulated the question. Yes, sir.
OpenTofu is really about a CLI that runs on one machine that does an operation. And it's not about a service with a GUI or collaboration by collaboration, I mean orchestration in this case, of different users using it. It's kind of, I think a good analogy is OpenTofu is Git and these other services. So HashiCorp has Terraform Cloud, we have Terrateam, Spacelift, all these are GitHub. So you have this one tool using your computer and then wear this collaboration layer.
But are there limits?
I think there are challenges in that you have to learn to write OpenTofu /Terraform's language. And that's something, especially if you want to grow who in your organization is going to make infrastructure changes, they might not be interested in that. Or there's a whole lot of, well, I know I need the ELB resource, the Elastic Load Balancer resource, but it has 10,000 options. Like, I don't know which one I'm supposed to do. And that is where we see a lot of challenge going forward. If you really want to expand what the people in your organization can do, it's learning a whole ecosystem when maybe they just want to deploy a container.
Yeah.
And that the CLI is not going to solve that. I mean, Git, to go with the Git analogy still, if you ever read a man page for one Git command, it's like 60 pages long. And you learn like the 3 commands you need, and then you just go into GitHub and click around because you're like, all right, GitHub's going to do it for me. It's okay. Yeah. And I think that's sort of the analogy to go there. You have this really powerful tool, but can we bring people that aren't necessarily interested in learning all the nuances there into a world where they can do the thing without concern that they've done it wrong?
And is there a web management interface also?
Not with OpenTofu. It's just a CLI.
That's Terrateam.
Yeah, exactly.
The Terrateam part.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome Terrateam.
I have a Windows background, so I always want the Windows the interfaces. I want the next finish interface and deploy.
Hey, we're still Kubernetes podcast, of course, and we're talking about awesome software. But how do I deploy my Kubernetes cluster with OpenTofu?
There are Kubernetes resources for it within. There's a provider.
Mm-hmm.
It also depends if you want to use EKS, something like that, or just roll your own. There's a lot of documentation around what resources you would need and then how to configure them. So anything that involves the actual management of the cluster machines would probably be an OpenTofu operation.
Yeah.
But if you, for example, want to upgrade a pod or something like that, that you might go to something else, maybe Crossplane or something like that. So you'd really be managing, here's the infrastructure and how it connects, and here's my guarantees around security on that part. But then the stuff running in the cluster, you would probably use more of a Kubernetes-focused tool for that.
Okay, can I deploy my Kubernetes cluster on-premise also with OpenTofu? Are there providers for that? Or is it more cloud-based?
It's definitely focused on cloud-based. We kind of think of OpenTofu / Terraform as the lingua franca of the cloud. So here's the language you use to manage your cloud. That being said, there are OpenStack providers, if you're right. So you would need some sort of layer that turns those into an API. Okay. So there's OpenStack. I haven't seen a provider for it, but I'm super excited for, have you heard of Oxide Computers? So they are trying to redesign what an on-premise computer looks like. So they sell these massive racks that you can get. I don't know how many computers in it, a lot. I think the thing weighs like 2 or 3 tons or something like that. And it draws like 15 kilowatts of power.
It's nothing for my backyard.
No, this isn't for the home lab. But one thing that's really cool is they're trying to make, they're trying to bridge this gap of you have these complicated things like OpenStack that are kind of a challenge to manage. Mm-hmm. Versus just a machine you get with nothing on it and you install everything. So their software has an API for how to deploy all these machines on their rack. And then inside of that, they're kind of like a cloud computer that you can buy. So again, they only had their first public delivery, I think, a month or so ago. But I think we're going to start seeing providers for things like that. And I'm hoping if what they do becomes more successful, more people will try to deliver these on-premise API-based massive computers.
Because you see companies going to cloud, going back from cloud, going on-premise. Mm-hmm. And
in the past, I've experimented with Azure Stack also. It's also the same way. You can buy a rack of Azure services. And
that's also expensive.
It's very expensive.
Yeah.
And it's Microsoft. It's Microsoft is good.
There we go again.
Yeah. But really, if you're on OpenTofu, the cloud is where it's going to shine.
Yeah, okay. It's the language for the cloud.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Brings us almost to our final question, Jan. Or do you have some other,
No, I'm
wait for it.
I'm ready for a final question.
Closed captioning, suspense builds.
Our final question always is, how do you see the future of Kubernetes and also your case, OpenTofu?
Oh, I was hoping we're going to avoid this question because my dirty secret is I don't use Kubernetes. For
delete.
Well, it was nice having you here. And that's really because, like I said, we're focused on these small organizations and Kubernetes. The value really comes in my opinion, when you have a larger group.
I don't have that opinion, but
okay.
Go
all
on.
right. So that's my opinion. So we think I personally think the biggest impact I can have on these smaller organizations is around how to get their pretty simple infrastructure in a point where they can grow to use Kubernetes if they want to in the future or stay that way. That being said, where's the future of like IaC and where maybe Kubernetes fits into that is I think the code, infrastructure in code is great. It's fantastic. I think we're probably going to see more of that becoming, the code is more of a human readable database and people interact with the code less directly. So you still want to be able to do pull requests. Someone wants to say, this is the change I want to do. Someone has to sign off on it. And I think we've seen there's a lot of value in keeping things as plain text, just because you can build so much more on top of that. You have any tool can read in plain text, like a YAML file or a Terraform file and then work on it. So I think it makes a lot of sense for those things to be able to talk to each other in terms of these human readable formats, but it's going to change to how we actually interact with them.
Okay. But I'm still curious because I heard a different philosophy from both of you about Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So maybe it wasn't the final question.
Throw down.
I can hear the listeners asking the same question now. Okay. Elaborate.
So in my opinion, Kubernetes comes with a lot of power. And like you said earlier, simple and flexibility don't necessarily go together. Mm-hmm. And a lot of Kubernetes is very flexible. And the necessary operations needs that I think Kubernetes has is above the amount of resources the people we interact with want to put into it. They really want I want to spin up my, more like an ECS solution. I have my containers. I want to run them. I want them to get bigger sometimes and fewer other times. And that's the limit of how much I really am interested in controlling these things. And they get a lot of value from just using the direct API endpoints and services that their cloud provider gives them and just connecting those.
Okay, so you're saying that the smaller companies use an abstract layer already around Kubernetes to run their container workloads. I think, in my opinion, also the smaller companies can benefit of the big Kubernetes, but you don't have to make it that difficult.
You don't have to.
And also smaller companies, because I've got lots of small companies as customer, they want to use the continuous delivery, continuous deployment strategies, and that's easy in Kubernetes.
So I see a question mark.
I guess respectfully disagree in the sense that not that Kubernetes is necessarily hard, but in the sense that a lot of the cloud infrastructure just already does it without the extra layer.
Yeah, I can see that, but I'm still...
But you're also giving up certain things with that. And for the people we work with, they're okay with that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I heard a lot of people also talk about if you look at the cloud platforms like Amazon, Google, and Azure, they already use Kubernetes in the background, but you don't see it anymore. Is that a way of thinking also? Because you just deploy your service or your container in a way, I want to deploy it there, and I don't care what is the background of those services that I use, because I want it to run. That's all I want.
Yeah.
How it runs, I don't care.
No, but you're giving so much flexibility away.
As in you're losing it in that case?
Yeah, you're losing it.
Yeah. But again, like simplicity and flexibility, sometimes these are at odds.
Yeah.
And I think, so when we look at a problem, or when I look at a problem, I think of what are the semantics I want to give the user, and then what is the implementation underneath that. So for example, something like ECS, you want this flexible way to run, and by flexible, I mean scale up, scale down pretty easily. To run containers, you don't need a lot of knobs to turn necessarily. And so you can build that on top of Kubernetes, but the user doesn't care what's behind it. It could be HashiCorp Nomad, because the semantics you're giving them are just give me your container and tell me the limits on how big and how small. And I think that's really valuable in that you have these clearly defined smaller semantics, and then what's underneath it is whatever makes sense as the implementer. So for Amazon, maybe it makes sense to do that as a Kubernetes thing.
They're still running Kubernetes, but
okay. Well,
but they're a massive cloud provider, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
And they give all these things out with these well-defined smaller semantics, which is really nice. I like it. Personally, I like that. I like it when you've got this big problem and someone's like, "Well, I've figured out what the semantics are for the smaller problem that you want to solve, so you only have to worry about those."
Yeah, but I'm probably too much old school. I want control.
Yeah.
And I don't like that somebody else has that control.
Yeah. I mean, I do. I like running my own self-hosted software a lot of times. I just enjoy sort of keeping up to date with how to manage and configure all this stuff. I have like a machine that's in a closet somewhere that I run certain stuff on, and I find it to be a really enjoyable experience, and I learn a lot and keep up to date. And Also, it is, I know how stuff works underneath as well.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't know that anymore.
Yeah.
So that's a complete different topic.
Different topic, yeah. But, yeah. We have to wrap up now.
Yeah, it's time to wrap up.
You open up a really good can of worms, and now we can't talk about it.
Well, Malcolm, it was great having you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun.
And where can people find you?
So, Terrateam.io is our company.
Yep.
Also, I have a YouTube channel called Boring Sailing, which is about me sailing around and being really bad at it. So,
Okay, great. Well, people
And of course, OpenTofu, eh?
OpenTofu,
yes,
yeah.
Remember
opentofu.org.
OpenTofu.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again, and we will follow you on your adventures on the sailboat. And hope to talk to you again in the future, man.
Thanks a lot. I hope to be back.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Deze podcast is een initiatief van IaC-ICT en wij zijn te beluisteren op onze website k8spodcast.nl via Spotify, Apple, Google Podcast en alle andere favoriete podcastproviders.